Hello, and welcome back to Caffè Fibonacci.
Today we're going to be talking about transparency and transparency flattening.
Yes. That's going to be an interesting episode. Actually, it's going to be so interesting that we decided to make 2 episodes out of it.
Yeah, we're going to be talking today about a couple of things that you can do with transparency in InDesign and Illustrator, and then talk a little bit about what happens when you take your document with live transparency and save it into PostScript or flattened PDF.
Yes.
And we will also have, as part of this episode, an interview with the engineer that wrote InDesign's transparency flattening engine. So
Cool.
that will be good to have him. His name is Matt Phillips, and he has graciously agreed to be on our episode today.
Very nice. So why don't you show us some new features in InDesign CS3 concerning transparency?
Okay, yeah, what I've got here is an imaginary magazine cover, and just to give you some background on this, when I was in Amsterdam a few months ago, I was reading my little Amsterdam guidebook, and it discussed this sport called eel pulling.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I guess it was in the last 300 years they would do this when the canals would freeze over. Or no, they didn't freeze over. It was just in the canals they would string eels on a line across a canal, and men would stand up in boats and wobbly boats and compete and see how many eels they could pull off these lines. And apparently it was a very serious sport. And since every sport imaginable in the U.S. has a magazine, I say, well, why not eel pulling? So this was our imaginary, this is my conception of what an eel pulling sports magazine would look like. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this magazine cover as a setting to show off some of the transparency features that were new in InDesign CS3.
And is this an actual eel puller? That's how eel pullers look like, or looked like?
It's my conception of what an eel puller might have looked like.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it takes a special man to be an eel puller, and I think this guy has what it takes. So first thing I'm going to do is select this object up here. Now this piece of vector art here, it's some text that I converted to outlines and then merged together using the Pathfinder. And what I want to do, though, is kind of jazz it up visually for the masthead of this magazine, the cover of this magazine. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up InDesign's new effects palette, and I'm going to go to the object options, double-click, and that brings up the effects dialog box. And here you'll see a bunch of new options that weren't in previous versions of InDesign. Previous versions of InDesign let you do blend modes and drop shadows and feathering, but now we've added several more effects. We've actually taken code from Photoshop, and that's why this looks very, very similar to Photoshop. So if you're familiar with Photoshop and its transparency options, you're familiar with what InDesign does. So instead of a normal drop shadow on this object, I'm going to use an inner shadow effect, and you can see that it will preview for me right there, and I'm happy with the way that looks, just the way it is. Then on this live text here, I'm going to open up the text portion of that object, and you'll notice here that another new aspect of the transparency effects in InDesign CS3 is you now have the ability to apply an effect to, in this case, the entire object, the stroke, the fill, or just the text inside. So you can have independent effects going on for different aspects of this object. I could have one effect on the stroke and another one on the fill and another one on the text, or I could leave the text alone. But in this case, I am going to mess with the text a bit. I would like to put a little bit of a bevel and emboss, but I think 7 points is too much. I'm going to knock it down to about 4. And because this is InDesign, this remains live text. I can edit this text with the effect applied without any problem. So I could do a late stage edit if I needed to without hurting myself. So there I've got those two effects, inner shadow and a bevel and emboss on the text up there. Now I want to move on to another new effect in InDesign CS3. I'm going to select this spot color rectangle that I have behind these other objects here, and I'm going to open that object up, and you'll notice now that we've added some feathering options. Basic feather was what was in earlier versions of InDesign. We've now added directional feather, and then the one that I'm going to show right now, gradient feather. And you'll see that gradient feather enables you to create a little ramp here, basically a gradient mask, and I can put as many stops on this ramp as I want. I could add more stops and play with the percentages there, but I'm just going to stick with 2. I'm going to keep it simple in this example, and then I can control whether it's linear or radial. Then I can also control the angle of this effect. That's kind of cool. I can now control the direction of a feathering and just to feather one side of an object, and I couldn't do that before.
That's really cool because that's a feature that users have been screaming for.
It's been a popular request, and there've been ways to fake it. There were ways to fake it, but which involved several steps. But it's nice just to have the real thing there. One of the nicest things about all of these transparency features now is some of the most interesting visual effects that you can create is not using these effects in isolation, but stacking objects on top of each other and making these effects interact. So what I've got here is this black and white version of the image. Behind it, I have a blurry version with an orange tint on it. And so what I'm going to do to this guy here is open up Object, and I'm going to apply a gradient feather to the top version of this image, like so. And then by adjusting the angle here and playing with the ramp, what I can do is I can make the image beneath show through the image on top. And I want to look for something like that. I'm happy with that effect. And the last thing I want you to notice here is, just like in the early versions of InDesign, I've created an object style for all of these little white frames around these photographs here. And what I'm going to do is go into this object style and open it and edit it. All of these transparency effects can be stored as part of your object styles, thereby then easily apply it and edit it. I'm going to update this the definition of this object style by putting a bevel and emboss on these objects. And let me see. Well, I'm going to do it on the fill of that, I think. There we go. And I'm going to knock the size of that bevel down just a little bit, down to about 3 points. And there they go. See, they've all instantly updated because I made the change in the object style, not on individual objects. So you've really got a ton of new creative options in InDesign CS3 with transparency.
Yeah, we're going to create some transparency effects inside of Illustrator, and you're going to be putting these inside of your InDesign document to make the transparency effect even more complex.
Yes.
Okay, and then we're going to see the results of what happens to the file when it gets exported or otherwise printed.
When it gets exported into a flat file format, whether it's PostScript or PDF 1.3.
Exactly. So here I have your cover in the JPEG format. It's actually an image that you exported directly out of InDesign. And I'm going to Illustrator, create a new document on which I'm going to drop that image as a base for what I'm going to do. So I believe that your document was actually 648 points by 783, right?
That's right.
Okay, that's pretty much correct. Okay, and just say OK. And out of Bridge, I'm going to pull this image over and put it right on top of my document. Okay, that's a pretty good base. And just to make sure I'm not touching that, I'm going to create a new layer on which I'm going to apply that transparency effect. And I'm going to lock the background layer. Now, what I'm going to use is the symbol sprayer and symbol stainer and these symbol tools. Okay? So what I want to add on that cover are some sort of sparkling effects, which you will then be able to use on your InDesign document. So I don't really know how to draw a sparkle, so I thought, let's look inside of Illustrator's symbols. And there are lots of symbol libraries available just to look at and use inside of Illustrator. They're all here. And the one I'm looking at is the Celebration symbol library. Because in here, I have something called Sparkler. Okay? So all I need to do is drop that symbol on my Illustrator document, and I can start working with it. Let's zoom in here a second and look at it. I don't need that little stick there for the sparkler. Okay? I just need the sparkle. So what I need to do is remove that. And in the past, I would have had to go in the symbols palette and unlink the symbol to be able to work on it. Now, I can simply double-click on the symbol, and we'll go into isolation mode. And we can see that we've actually gone one level deeper inside of the document. And we see that right up here on the top left part of my window. And I could go back to my entire document and back to my symbol. Okay? And then, now that I can access my symbol, I can take my direct selection tool and select that stick and just delete it. And let's delete that little part as well. And take that object and just place it back into my symbols library.
So now you've got a symbol that is all sparkle and no stick.
Exactly. So let's call that sparkle and save it. What I'm going to do now is use the spraying tools. Let's go to the full cover. I'm actually going to pull out the window by letting go on this sidebar here and use the sprayer tool first. And I'm going to spray some sparkle over here like that. And then maybe I'm going to use the symbol shifter tool to make sure that the symbols are in place where I want them. That's actually very useful, so I can actually shift symbols inside of that selection. Mm-hmm. I can also scrunch the symbols together, like find areas inside of my artwork where the symbols should come together. Mm-hmm. I can make the symbols bigger, or if I hold down the Alt key, I can make them smaller. So this allows me to have a variety of symbols inside of my artwork, so smaller, bigger. Mm-hmm. But the one I love most is the symbol spinner tool, because this allows me to make all the symbols look different, because they're all spinning into different directions that way. I'm simply spraying on my actual symbols there. And none of these symbols now look so similar, because they have different directions, different shapes, different sizes. And then I can also stain these symbols with other colors. For example, if I go to my swatches panel and choose a red color, for example, I can then spray on the symbols and apply that red color onto some of these sparkles. And then, since we're talking about transparency, I can use the symbol screener tool and make some of these symbols more transparent than others. Okay? Is this something that you can work with, Tim?
I think so, yeah. We can pretty this guy up a little bit with your variable sparkles.
Okay, so I'm just going to place these sparkles on the cover, get rid of the background, and save it and give it back to you.
Okay. So I've received Rufus's little sparkle illustration, and let's blow it up a little bit here in Bridge, and there it is. So I'm going to grab that sparkle and then toggle back over to InDesign and drop it on a layer here. And I've got this object on my page. I've got it tucked in a little bit of layer here. I'm going to move it. Whoops, let's switch back to the selection tool. And I'm just going to nudge it back down in this corner like this. And I've got it underneath a couple of other transparent layers. I've got it underneath this photo with the gradient feather on it. And while I've still got it selected, I'm going to further complicate matters by just applying another effect to it. There's a little bit more of a blend mode and a more feathering on there. So there I have
pretty complex document, like with different layers of transparency. And maybe we can explain the presence of the cake.
Well, let's first talk about what we've done here in this document. In a way, what we're creating here is, as far as InDesign and Illustrator are concerned, are documents that are sort of three-dimensional. We've got stacks of objects, one on top of the other, and it's aware of layers. It's aware of, I've got certain objects sitting on top of other objects, and they're interacting in different ways with these transparency effects. And in a way, it's very much like this layer cake here, this beautiful layer cake. We've got layers of things stacked one on top of the other. But something is going to happen to this document if we export as an EPS or just as a PostScript file.
And distill it, like many users still do.
Yeah, like many users still do. They dump out an EPS or a PostScript file and then distill that in Acrobat Distiller. Or from InDesign, they might export directly from InDesign but use PDF 1.3. And there's a significant change that happens to these documents when you export into those particular formats. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit, and we're going to use this cake here as an example. So I want everybody to look very closely, very carefully at this cake. You can see the layers, and in an instant here we're going to show you what happens if I were to make, well, metaphorically, a PostScript version of this cake.
Yeah.
So pretend now that this chocolate cake represents our beautiful layered InDesign file. We can see the cake, we can see the layers, but now we're going to export it into a different file format. And let's see what happens to this InDesign file when we dump it into something like EPS, PDF 1.3, or PostScript. So ready? Let's count down, Rufus.
All right.
1, 2, 3, PostScript! So Rufus, what happened to our beautiful InDesign document?
Well, Tim, I think it got flattened.
Flattened? What's that?
Well, I'm going to show you. In InDesign, I'm just going to create a couple of shapes and some transparency effects, and then we're going to see what happens when it's flattened and when it's not flattened, okay?
Okay.
And, you know...
Well, why does flattening happen to begin with?
Well, it happens
Why did we shout PostScript and squish that cake? That's my question to you.
Because PostScript is in 2-dimension.
You mean it's a 2-dimensional space rather than 3-dimensional?
Exactly.
Okay.
It can't have layers.
So it had to take our beautiful cake with layers
Yes.
and compress it or convert it to a 2-dimensional space where layers don't exist.
I'm pretty sure it still tastes like a cake.
Sure.
But
it's still cake.
It's still
in the same way that your InDesign document is still your design document, but it just has a very, very different structure than what it had before.
Exactly.
It's not what you originally created.
Exactly. So to just demonstrate that, what I'm going to do is just create a couple of very simple shapes on here, and let's go into the swatches and make that maybe a cyan square with no stroke, and then on top of that, actually let's make that square a spot color. That's better, because I want to show another thing when we look at that in Acrobat. So let's make that a spot color fill with no stroke, and then over that I want to put in a circle, something like this, and this circle we're going to make cyan and no stroke, and then we're going to add one of the most used transparency effects, which is
multiply,
the drop shadow. Okay.
Oh.
Yes. So object.
Well, yeah,
effects,
that's the most used.
That's the most used. So drop shadow. And with that new window now, the really cool thing is that I can preview everything. I can change the angle. I can also change the distance, the offset. So let's make that maybe 5 millimeters and 5 millimeters. And what I'm going to do is to change the size of that into 5 millimeters. So we really have a soft shadow under here.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So the first thing I'm going to do is to export as a PDF 1.4. which does not require transparency flattening. Okay? So, File, Export. Let's save that as 1.4.pdf on the desktop. Save. And I'm going to save both these PDFs for press quality, okay? The highest quality possible. And I'm going to choose Acrobat 5, PDF 1.4. Okay, which does not require transparency flattening. Actually,
why doesn't it require it?
Because that level of PDF allows for different layers inside of the PDF, so has live transparency.
So we might say that the PDF object model, the PDF page description language
has evolved.
Yeah,
from
has evolved.
1.3 to 1.4.
And it can support stacks of objects live transparency, whereas PDF 1.3
exactly.
cannot.
Just like that cake used to be. Okay?
Exactly. Okay.
And as a matter of fact, under the advanced options, we see that the transparency flattener is grayed out, okay, because it's not necessary for PDF 1.4. So let's export that. Let's just make sure it opens in Acrobat. Okay. It's generating the PDF. And now we're going to have a look at it in Acrobat. I'm just going to make it full page, and this is the PDF we get. Okay? So I'm going to go back to InDesign and make the same PDF, export. Let's make that 1.3, which requires flattening. We're still going to keep press quality to have the highest possible quality of that PDF, but we're going to move it down to PDF 1.3 for Acrobat 4. And under the advanced options, we're actually going to see that the transparency flattener is not grayed out anymore. And here we can choose between different presets. And it's really important that we always choose high resolution, because these other presets will lower the quality of the transparency flattening, therefore creating artifacts that are of lower resolution.
That might appear, that might appear when if you're putting to a high-res device.
So we're going to choose the high-resolution preset and export that file. And now, under Window, I'm going to tile these vertically. And what we see is that both these documents, let's go at the same percentage, 69%. And basically what we see, if we have two identical PDFs, and even if we zoom in here with the tools, the zoom tools, I like the loop tool. It's very old school, you know, when you looked on the films. And as you can see, passing over the document, I see that in the 1.4 PDF, the shadow is perfectly over the spot color here, and everything works just fine. And the same thing goes for the 1.3. So you may ask, so what's the difference, Rufus?
What is the difference?
Yes,
Rufus?
I'm going to show you. Under Tools, Advanced Editing, I'm going to choose the Touch-Up Object tool. Actually, I'm going to show the Advanced Editing toolbar, so I have access to it at all times. And with the Object Selection tool, what I can do in the 1.4 PDF, let's take it here. I need to take it for each PDF. So Tools, Advanced Editing, show Advanced Editing toolbar, and use the Touch-Up Object tool. And I can actually select the objects inside of my document, okay? And what we can note is as I move these layers around, the shadow that's on top of the spot color is actually live, okay? And I can move the objects and nothing is broken. We actually have the layers of information.
You have the same objects fully intact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On the other hand, in the 1.3, when I start moving the objects, for example, this one, let's take the Touch-Up Object tool. We see the circle is the same, but as soon as I start moving other objects, such as the square down here, we see that other objects have been created to simulate the shadow. Okay, this is exactly what happened to our cake.
Okay, so what you've shown us here is that you've shown us the difference between PDF 1.3 and PDF 1.4 and the way that they treat these transparent objects. And from a production perspective, it might be kind of nice to know in advance and be able to predict exactly what's going to happen, how your objects are going to be converted, changed, cut up, and modified into a flattened environment as opposed to non-flattened environment. And so not coincidentally, here in InDesign, I have that same magazine cover open, but now I've got the Flattener preview palette displaying, and I'm currently highlighting raster, fill, text, and strokes. The Flattener preview palette is in InDesign in order to show you probably the way the document is going to be modified when it's flattened. So when the flattener creates that jigsaw puzzle, if I am exporting into a raw PostScript file or EPS or PDF 1.3, I can see in advance, ahead of time, what's going to happen, which objects are going to be changed, and how they're going to be changed. And this palette is there not only to let you know what's going to happen, but also to let you evaluate what's going to happen and see if there's a problem that's going to be created, because sometimes there's certain things you don't want to change. For example, if I had a transparent object that was partly over some text and part of the text was rasterized and part of it was still vector, that could create a different appearance.
It's a way to avoid possible problems.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. And so what we've got here is in Flattener Preview is the ability to look for different things. Do I have any text that's been outlined? And right now it's going to update and show me, okay, now this word up here, pulling, that text is outlined and filled with a rasterized fill in order to create the look of transparency.
So this text on the InDesign document is live text.
Yes.
So once it's put through PostScript or the Flattener, it will not be live text anymore.
No, it's going to be converted into vector outlines with a rasterized or bitmap fill in order to create that bevel.
So you're already losing some information.
You are losing information, and you're absolutely losing editability when you do that. So that is why the Flattener Preview is there. It's to let you know what's going to happen to a document with transparency when it goes into a flattened format, whether it's PostScript or PDF 1.3. Okay, so now what we have in Acrobat, in the same way that you showed your circle and square examples in Acrobat, we're doing essentially the same thing but with a more complex document. And what we have over here on the right is the flattened version of the PDF. This was exported with PDF 1.3, and we select the Touch-Up Object tool and did a Select All. And you can see how many different puzzle pieces this has been cut into. In Flattener terminology, we call these atomic regions. In order to flatten it and simulate the look of transparent objects, it has to cut it up into a lot of smaller pieces. Over here is the version with live transparency. This was done in PDF 1.5 or 6. And you can see there are a lot fewer atomic regions because all of the objects are still intact.
Yes.
And the transparency is live because the PDF model supports live transparency in a document like this, so hence it doesn't need to cut it up into so many pieces. So in the same way that that cake was flattened and effectively turned into a jigsaw puzzle of delicious fudgeness, your document gets cut up into a jigsaw puzzle in PDF 1.3 or PostScript. And it doesn't matter at that point. If you take that flattened PostScript file and then distill it into like PDF 1.4, 5, 6, or 7, it doesn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's still flat. You've still got that jigsaw puzzle, irrespective of whether or not you're using a PDF version that supports transparency or not. It's done. So if you're in any workflow that's forcing you to go through PostScript first, you by definition are dealing with a flattened file when you do your output. And there are certain problems that can arise because of that. And we're very fortunate to have one of the InDesign engineers, in fact, the engineer that wrote InDesign's transparency flattener with us. He joined us for a live interview, and he's going to give us some more detail about what happens during flattening and explain the flattener dialog box. And so we're going to go to that interview right now.
We're here with Matt Phillips, who's one of the InDesign engineers. He's the engineer that implements InDesign's transparency features, and he's going to explain to us a little bit about why the InDesign transparency features look the way they do and how the transparency flattener works. Thank you, Matt, very much for making the time to join us.
Sure, glad to do it.
Okay. First thing I'd like to ask you about is about just the effects panel, the stuff that's in there, the user interface, why it looks the way it does, why we've got the features in there that we do. Can you give us sort of a little technical background on how the transparency features for CS3 were developed and implemented?
Sure. There were two basic things that we were asked for CS3. One of them was, can I put effects on more than just the object? I want to be able to put it just on the text or just on the stroke or just on the fill, the background of a frame. So I want to feather the background, but I don't want to feather the text. So one of the things we added was the ability to select object versus stroke versus fill, or if it's text frame, you can have text, and localize your effects for just that part of the object. The other thing that we got a lot of requests for were, can I please do bevel and emboss, or a different kind of gradient, or that sort of thing in InDesign instead of having to go to Photoshop and do that and bring it in. So we did add that. So previously in CS2 we had only basic transparency attributes and drop shadows, and a feather, which is now called basic feather. And to that mix we added some of the effects from Photoshop, inner shadow, outer glow, so on, as you can see. One of them is unique to InDesign, which is directional feather. The rest are mostly, I think, Photoshop. The other thing we did is normalized our user interface around the Photoshop presentation so that when I go in, choose inner shadow, I have the inner shadow selected, and the layout of the controls is approximately what you see in Photoshop. We didn't do everything Photoshop supports because they have an imaging model that allows for a lot more flexibility, and over the years people have asked for this and this to be added. We didn't want to redo everything that Photoshop does. The other interesting thing about Photoshop is that they already had all this code to do all of these effects, or at least generate the masks for the effects. And so rather than reinvent that wheel too, we asked Photoshop to help us by sharing some of that code with us. So the actual shapes and the shape of the image masks that are used to actually apply that opacity pattern or shadow or a mask, any of these things, is actually the same code that Photoshop uses. The difference is that InDesign composites that using its own imaging model. So the effect is not exactly 100% the same in all situations, but it should be awfully close.
Okay. Well, we've already shown people the new features in CS3, give them a quick look at those. So what we'd really like you to do for us today is to walk us through the transparency flattener, because that's sort of an enigmatic dialog box for a lot of users. So we thought we'd ask you, the author of that, to walk us through it and give us some technical background on the flattener.
Sure. The good news is that actually this is a lot simpler than it used to be. So the first thing I'll say is that most of the controls that you'll see in this obscure dialog, as you point out, were meant for a time when processors were not as fast and people did not have as much memory as they do today. So some of these things may still apply to you in special cases, but if you have a relatively recent machine, you may be able to simplify your workflow here quite a bit. What I would say, what I'll do is I'll go through these controls and tell you what they do.
Well, first of all, let's talk about
and explain what.
Let's talk about flattening generically, because in the workflows that people have available today, if someone's going to be outputting through a PDF, Adobe PDF RIP, then flattening's not an issue. So let's first explain why there's a flattener at all, and then talk about the options in that dialog box.
Right. So there are two places where you really don't have a choice but to flatten. Flattening is the process by which we take transparent artwork and create a second version of that artwork, which has all the transparency collapsed down. All the objects are composited together. So if you have a transparent image on top of some background, we have to create a new image that represents that image with the background composited into it, for example. And what you end up with is then not two objects, but a single object that has those together. Or in some cases, we have to break up objects into multiple objects in order to satisfy all the different intersections. So it's a complicated bit of code, which you can avoid with a PDF RIP and a 1.4 or higher workflow in PDF. But if you're working with PDF 1.3 or a PostScript output workflow, then you do have to flatten because those two don't support transparency.
Yeah, the way that
there are still cases where you.
I'm sorry, excuse me, but the way that we've described it for people is within the applications, the native live transparency is almost like a three-dimensional stack of objects. But what happens when you go into PDF 1.3 or PostScript is you're forcing the software to create a two-dimensional jigsaw puzzle that looks like your transparent objects, but is in fact a flat two-dimensional interpretation of it. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. I mean, I can actually provide a real quick show you here on the screen. But if I have this object here and another one on top of it that's, say, yellow and set to multiply, then what we have created here are actually three objects when it's flat. One is this area that corresponds to the box, to the yellow area, one that corresponds to the cyan area, and one new area that corresponds to the yellow with the cyan together.
Yeah.
The flattener would actually create three separate shapes.
Yeah, we actually show people that with a by taking making a 1.4 PDF and a 1.3 PDF and deconstructing it within Acrobat to show them how that puzzle is actually made. But that's a good explanation. So now let's look at the flattener itself, and I guess what we're asking you to do is to explain to people why there are flattener options at all. Why do we need these options in a flattener, and why would I adjust them? Why would I make changes to those flattener settings?
Sure. So the flattener has a lot of its work cut out for it. In the simple example we just went over with those three shapes, it's fairly straightforward. But when you throw in other elements like images, gradients, these all complicate matters pretty quickly because calculating what artwork should resemble the original gets to be kind of complicated. So there are, as in many things, there are options that you have over that process. Most of these options, well, there are two sides to these options. One has to do with performance, and one has to do with appearance. So what I alluded to earlier with performance is that when these settings were created and when the flattener was first created, there was a real concern that the amount of memory and processor speed on a computer might be overwhelmed by the flattening process with complicated documents. So the approach that we took was to give control over the performance aspect. And if we look at the elements in this dialog, the first 1, 2, and this last one here all have to do with performance. The raster vector balance is a lovely name control, which determines a threshold where the flattener will stop trying to calculate the intersection between lots of objects and instead just rasterize those objects. So ideally, it keeps all the vector outlines for the flattened artwork, but if it thinks that that's going to take too long and generate too large a file or use too much memory, then it will stop. It will cry uncle and say, all right, I can't do that. I'm going to rasterize it, which we know has a fixed cost. Mm-hmm. The problem with rasterizing, of course, is that it has a quality impact. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the presets that we support, low, medium, and high resolution, the low and the medium actually have this raster vector slider set farther down from 100%. Which what that means is at this sort of arbitrary 75% level, when it gets that complicated, it'll go ahead and rasterize. If we set it to 100%, it will never rasterize. It'll take as long as it needs to, use as much memory as it needs to do a full vector flattening.
Which is
now,
you would want to do if you have if your equipment is up to it and if you want to maintain the best possible quality.
Exactly. So in terms of a modern system, so if you're running on a system that's 5 years old, then you may need to play with the slider on a certain class of documents to get the quality performance trade-off that works for you. But if you have a system that's fairly new with, let's say, a gig of RAM and a reasonably fast processor, there's almost no occasion to drop this below 100 because there's no need to recover that processing time. It's not a real factor in the output anymore. The only case where you'd ever set it to less than 100 nowadays is if you just have a very, very strange document. You may find that a document, for some reason, is taking a long, long time to output, even though it doesn't have gigantic images or anything in it. And you notice that it has thousands of little strokes that are overlapping and all set to difference blend mode or something like that. If you see a symptom like that, then you can come in here and reduce this below 100. But otherwise, today I don't think I would do anything but 100.
Okay, but it's important to I think it's important to I guess recognize or educate people about the reason that this is there is because our flattener is capable of preserving vector art and doing high quality transparency effects as opposed to just rasterizing everything.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, rasterizing is something to be avoided, and the only reason we rasterize is as a performance concession. So if we know that if you have this set to below 100, then there is a point at which it will say, well, this is going to take too long, so we'll rasterize.
Okay.
But as I say, other than very, very degenerate documents, you should not hit that case in practice.
Okay, so for most of us all the time, people should not be scared of keeping that slider all the way on the vector end of the scale.
Right, and the simple way to do that is just to always have high resolution selected at output. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that with some confidence is that you may look at this first number that says 1200 and say to yourself, well, 1200, that's either much higher or much lower than I consider appropriate for my workflow or my printer. And the good news is that at 100, this number is really not used anywhere in the flattener except in some very convoluted cases. And mostly having to do with the cap of resolutions when certain kinds of images are combined together in certain kinds of ways. Mm-hmm. But most likely this is not going to affect you. You can set it to any number you like to reassure yourself. It should never be higher than your printer's native resolution. But as I say, at 100%, this doesn't kick in. Below 100%, if I do trap some kind of rasterization threshold and I have to rasterize, this is the resolution that rasterization will take place at, and that's why we call it line art text. Mm-hmm. Because if you're going to rasterize text, you want to be sure that it's at your printer's resolution or some acceptably high resolution.
And when you say printer, you also mean like output device, so your whatever the resolution of the final output device, the one that's doing the separations.
Exactly. Okay. The gradient and mesh resolution, as it suggests, has to do with resolution where a gradient, or if you have multiple gradients that are interacting This determines what resolution those gradients will be rasterized into so that they can be combined, since we can't necessarily combine multiple gradients together without creating an image. Given the gradients are typically lower resolution entities, we have a lower threshold here. This does apply for even 100% raster vector. So 300 is probably sufficient for most gradients, but if you run into an odd case where you have a gradient with a very, very sharp set of control points, then you may need to set it higher if it's basically acting not so much like a gradient and more like fine art. But that, as I say, is pretty uncommon. The two checkboxes here about converting to outlines have to do with maintaining consistency between text and strokes that are involved with transparency and those that aren't. The first one, again, is something that kind of, as we've improved the flattener and as we've improved output methods for both print and PDF, is becoming less and less important. Text that is involved in transparency and larger than, I believe it's about 12 points, or maybe it's 24 points, I think, I have to go check, can be converted to outline for PostScript output. So if text happens to be involved with transparency, then the print port will generate outlines and fill it with the correct artwork. Now in CS3, the PostScript team put in code that actually prevents the text from going to outlines when it's small text. And they do this by analyzing the fill of the text after flattening and trying to convert it into actually a vector representation of the flattened artwork. So you really don't get this problem with PostScript printing anymore, except larger text, which is less susceptible to outline problems anyway. Meaning, the reason that you would have done this in the past is that if you take small text and convert it to outlines and then image it on a printer, that typically follows a different set of imaging rules than text that hasn't been converted to outlines. And that'll show up as text that looks a little fatter or a little chunkier than text that has not been converted to outlines. So this checkbox is here if you want to force everything to outlines for consistency. But for most print work and for all PDF work, this is really no longer advisable. Converting strokes to outlines perhaps has more of a basis because strokes don't have the same kind of text protection the text does. So strokes that are involved with transparency will be converted to outlines. Strokes that are not involved with transparency won't. And sometimes you can tell the difference on a printer between the two. And if that is causing an output problem, you may want to turn that on so that everything gets converted to outlines for a consistent appearance.
Now I know that
the last entry here is clip comp.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead and finish that last option there, the clip complex regions.
Okay. Clip complex regions here is disabled because I've got this set to 100%. The logic there is that if I have it less than 100%, and therefore I can get a very complex region that gets rasterized, then clip complex regions is probably advisable because what that means is instead of just creating a rectangular outline for that rasterized portion that may cause some sort of visual artifact in your output, you can clip that image to the bounds of the objects that were complex enough to cause the rasterization. So it simplifies the output. It creates larger output, I should say, with this clipping path, but at least the effect is not so noticeable. But as I say, if you're running at 100%, then you don't need to worry about it.
But if you're running at less than 100%, you would recommend that people do select that option.
Yes, I would recommend you select the option for highest quality. There is some outside possibility that your RIP may not like the size of the clipping region that is applied. And if that's the case, you may have to turn it off. But as I say, these would be very, very degenerate documents or kind of an older, slower, low memory system that would need to worry about that.
Do you have a collection of degenerate documents there at your laboratory, Matt?
Oh, I get plenty of degenerate documents, but actually I get very few. The irony is actually that at something like 75, which I believe is the default for medium resolution, you have to work pretty hard to get rasterization, but it can happen. That's why 100%.
Okay, so that's a nice overview of the flattener. The one thing I was going to add is some people use that convert all text to outlines feature here in the flattener as a way to deliver a document with no embedded fonts and just outlines. They'll put a transparent object the size of their entire page, something with a very low opacity, just to force all the text on a page or in a document into outlines, and they'll do that specifically just to eliminate the worry for having font issues somewhere down the road. Any comment on that, or is that an abuse of your work, of your technology, Matt?
No, that's actually a fine way to use it. I don't have a problem with that. If you are going to do that, I wouldn't create a transparent object the size of the page. All you need is something like a 0% opaque white box at the bottom of the stacking order, so it has no chance of introducing any unnecessary flattening, and then you'll avoid any side effects of that.
At the bottom of the stacking order?
The thing people do in here.
Why would that? How would that force?
That's right. It shouldn't interact with anything.
Mm-hmm. Why does that force all the text to
convert all text to outlines says, regardless of whether the text is affected by transparency, convert it to outlines.
Oh, okay.
And so what you don't want to do is create, let's say, an opaque, a transparent object and put it on top of everything. Mm-hmm. What you want to do is actually make it small and put it at the very bottom.
What you're
and
saying
that way
is
you won't affect any of the artwork.
What you want to do is create a transparency interaction of some kind on the page in question, so that it will, so that the flattener will be invoked. Then is what you're saying.
Exactly right. But the flattener will quickly determine that there's nothing to do. But since you've asked that all text be converted to outlines, it will do so.
It just says okay.
The other thing that people do is use this setting all the way at 0 for raster vector balance. Mm-hmm. This is a special setting that says rasterize everything at this resolution, the line art and text resolution. And that's actually useful if you want to generate a raster page for whatever reason. You're having trouble with some vector element. It's actually a workaround or a debugging tool. As if I'm getting some kind of strange output, just rasterize everything and let me see what that looks like.
All right, well, that's very good. Thanks so much for that explanation of how the flattener works. And the last thing that I want you to talk about is, I remember you telling me once in a conversation that the basic flattener code itself isn't really that complex, but what gets complicated is the, I guess, the little asterisks and footnotes and special case handling that the transparency flattener does for specific RIPs, for specific devices. So depending on which type of device you're targeting with your flattening, InDesign will do special things to the output, to the PostScript, in order to accommodate a specific RIP. Can you give us a little background on that?
Yeah, that's actually, let's see how to describe that. The flattener is actually a component that our core tech engineering team designed and built. And it's the same piece of code that runs regardless of whether you're going to PostScript output or you're going to PDF output. So the flattener sits in front of those output paths and actually does the same thing regardless of your output. Mm-hmm. However, the ports themselves, that is the print code and the PDF code, do have different abilities to handle what comes out of the flattener. So the flattener, for example, will never convert text to outlines itself unless you've selected that text to outlines checkbox. Mm-hmm. It's actually the PostScript port that has to look at the text and look at the what is being asked to draw into the shape of the text and has to decide what to do. So, for example, there is no way in PostScript to say, here's some text, please draw an image into that text. Mm-hmm. So that's why the PostScript port traditionally has had to convert text to outlines when that text has to be filled with anything other than a solid color after flattening. PDF, on the other hand, has the ability to fill text with an image. So PDF does not have to convert text to outlines as a matter of course. But this has caused problems in the past with RIPs that take anything that's filled with an image and puts it through a different processing path than anything that's filled with a solid color. So in the case where you have a RIP that has a continuous tone layer and a line art layer, the text was being if you had text that was, say, touched by a drop shadow just a bit. So in this example on the screen, if I have text that's sitting below this drop shadow, then this text might get hit by the shadow. The portion that got hit by the shadow ends up getting filled with an image. The portion that didn't get touched by the shadow gets filled with solid black, and this caused the text that got hit by the shadow to end up on the continuous tone layer instead of the line art layer. Mm-hmm. And this caused it to be trapped differently and all sorts of bad effects, including low resolution output, so on. So this is why the PostScript team took a look at that code and figured out how to take that image and try to recover it as actual vector fill instead of image fill, and it has a very sophisticated algorithm for doing that. And that was something that, in theory, should not be required for proper output, but because we knew there was a class of RIPs that had this issue, we put that code in to try to help smooth that workflow. So there are other examples of RIPs.
Yeah. So what percentage of the Flattener code now is what percentage accommodates specific devices, and how much is just the original Flattener?
Most of the original Flattener is unchanged. Most of the things that were put in were very specific special cases. There were cases, for example, when spot colors are involved, where the RIPs were causing little white seams around the edges where the spot background met the process background. Mm-hmm. And so there were cases, for example, where the Flattener will now fill that area with an image that's 1 by 1 pixel instead of filling it with a solid color. And the reason is it causes the RIP to use a different code path that resolves the problem. So there are little tweaks there that each had to be weighed very carefully, because what you fix for one RIP might damage another RIP. So there's been a lot of testing that's gone into each little revision. A lot of revisions went into how, when you have images that are transparent and interact, and one is rotated and one isn't, and one is high resolution and one isn't, there are fairly complicated heuristics that have been designed to maximize the resulting quality. So all of these things have come up in either testing or in actual customer input, and we've had to go back and sort of tweak these heuristics to get the best output that we can. But we don't actually have any code, at least none that I'm aware of, that says, oh, I'm going to such and such RIP, therefore I'll do this. Mm-hmm. Everything that we do, we generate the same PostScript regardless of the RIP.
Okay. Well, that's a very good background, a very good explanation of what goes on there. And we got to work in the word heuristic, I believe, 3 times. So I consider that a job well done.
I can use the word algorithm, too.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, maybe in another episode. But thank you very much, Matt, for walking us through the Flattener, giving us that background, and we greatly appreciate your taking the time to talk with us.
Sure, Tim. It was good talking to you.
All right. Thanks. Take care. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Well, that's it for this episode of Caffè Fibonacci. Thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully you learned a little bit about transparency features in InDesign and Illustrator, and learned a lot about the nature of transparency flattening. In the next episode of Caffè Fibonacci, we're going to be exploring some new technology from Adobe that will enable you to avoid flattening completely in your print publishing workflow. So please join us for the next one. Thanks so much, and bye-bye.
Ciao.